Hola chicos y buenas tardes. Hoy vamos a hablar del subjuntivo. I'm going to be talking to you mostly about when we're going to use the subjunctive. If you would like a refresher on how to form the present subjunctive, you can check out pages 251 and 252 of your textbook. It has everything that you need to know, including any irregularities. But what I wanted to talk to you about is when and why we're going to use the subjunctive, because the reality is that we use it much more frequently in Spanish than we do in English. So it is something that you're going to have to know how to do well if you're going to be fluent. So let's talk about mood. What does mood mean? This refers to the attitude of the speaker towards what he or she is saying. In Spanish, there are three different moods: the indicative, the imperative, and the subjunctive. The same as in English, actually. There are three different moods. So this is how the speaker feels about what he or she is saying. The indicative mood we're going to use to talk about what is factual, describing what is going on currently, what is happening or what has happened or what will happen, what is. The imperative is when we tell people what to do. That's commands. And then the subjunctive we're going to use for everything else, basically, for what may be or for what is possible. So make sure you understand what the difference is between the indicative, the imperative, and the subjunctive. And what do I mean by mood? In Spanish, these are called modos: el indicativo, el imperativo, y el subjuntivo. So, we use the subjunctive mood much more frequently in Spanish than in English. We often avoid it in English, but there are many cases where we cannot avoid it in Spanish. One of the ways that we avoid it in English is by using infinitive phrases. For example, I want you to eat more vegetables. We're using the infinitive to eat as opposed to changing it to make a subjunctive statement. For example, I want that you eat more vegetables. Yes, I know it sounds super awkward because it's something that we avoid all the time in English. But in Spanish, the only way to say that would be quiero que tú comas más verduras. You can't avoid it there. So this is why we need to know what the subjunctive is and when we're going to use it. So let's talk about the subjunctive in English. You might think that it doesn't exist, but I promise you it does. It's just that we don't use it nearly as frequently as we do in English as we do in Spanish. So let's look at this example. Paco's mom insists that he clean his room. Well, that sounds okay to us, right? But when we think about conjugating verbs in English, remember that it's I clean, you clean, and he, what? Cleans, okay? So in this statement, Paco's mom insists that he clean his room. That form is changed. And the reason why it's changed is because it's actually the subjunctive there. Okay, he cleans would be our indicative statement. If I'm just describing what's going on in the indicative, Paco cleans his room. It's Paco cleans, not Paco clean, right? But it doesn't sound weird to say Paco's mom insists that he clean his room because that's the appropriate use of the subjunctive. That's just one example of the way that we use it in English. The infinitive phrase before was what I showed you before was one way in how we avoid it. So Paco cleans his room is the indicative. Paco limpia su cuarto would be the indicative in Spanish. That's exactly the same. So let's talk about how we're going to use the subjunctive in Spanish. First of all, this method, the way that we're going to use it now to start with, is called noun clauses. We need three things to be able to use the subjunctive here. A trigger phrase that expresses weirdo, and I'll talk about that in just a second, the conjunction que, and a change in subject. Remember that the subjunctive can't stand alone. It doesn't work like the indicative. It has to be preceded by something else. Yo quiero que tú comas más frutas. What we need here is our trigger phrase like quiero or querer plus a change in subject, and only then can we use the subjunctive. We cannot use it by itself, as in this example. You couldn't just say tú comas más frutas and leave the yo quiero que off. It doesn't work like that. So Paco limpia su cuarto has to be in the indicative. If you want to make it subjunctive and you want to add that little difference in meaning, then you've got to add that trigger phrase, just like I said before. Mamá quiere que Paco limpie su cuarto. And there is, Mom prefers that Paco clean his room. There's our subjunctive usage. So, if you remember, there is a big, long, super long list of trigger phrases. And you can remember a long list of words, absolutely, if that's what helps you. However, my recommendation is that you don't remember a super long list and you just think about if it expresses weirdo or not, because that's what I want you to really take away from this. Anytime we're expressing some kind of wish or will, emotion, influence, we're requesting someone or requesting that someone do something or recommend that someone do something, anytime we're expressing some kind of doubt that someone might do something or deny that someone might do something, or we're expressing our opinion about whether or not something might happen or someone might do something. Those are all reasons to use the subjunctive. Why? Because we're not talking about what is. We're not describing what's happening. We're not talking about the fact that Paco is cleaning his room. We're saying, Paco, I want you to clean your room. That's not a statement of what's going on. It's also not a command. It's not, Paco, clean your room. It's, Paco, I want you to clean your room. That's different than both the indicative and the imperative moods. So, trigger phrases, I'm going to refer to them, and I'm going to refer to them as trigger phrases, but please know that you do not have to remember a super long list. You are going to need to know some of the vocabulary around these uses, but what I want you to think about first and foremost is whether or not it expresses something that requires using the subjunctive. You've got to get that emotion, that opinion, that request, that wish or the will. We're talking about things that may not happen, things that are possible, things that are uncertain, and things that might be, not things that are. So here's your reflection. I want you to think about this. Remember that using the English is not necessarily the best way to determine whether or not we should use subjunctive or indicative, because we don't use subjunctive and indicative the way that we do in Spanish. So thinking about this, I want you to write down either S or I, number your paper 1 through 8, and then write down subjunctive, S for subjunctive or I for indicative on your paper. That's all I want you to do. Think about whether these statements would require using indicative or subjunctive in Spanish. Think about whether or not they are expressing certainty, uncertainty, a request, a recommendation, emotion, an opinion, etc. So go ahead and pause the video and jot down S or I for numbers 1 through 8. This should be at the bottom of your notes. Okay, so let's talk about this. John wants Mary to go out with him. That's an infinitive phrase. We are avoiding using the subjunctive here. But if I'm saying that John wants Mary to go out with him, am I making a statement of fact? Am I saying that Mary is going out with him? Or that Mary went out with him? Or even Mary will go out with him? No, I'm saying that John wants Mary to go out with him. It's John's preference that she go out with him, which means this is going to have to be subjunctive. Okay, look at the second one. I'm happy that you got a good job. Well, happy is an emotion, so yes, you got it. It's going to be subjunctive. I doubt Roberto will arrive today. Well, that's future, right? Isn't will arrive going to be in the indicative? No, not necessarily, because we're doubting that he's going to arrive today. We're not talking about the fact that he's arriving, or we're not even just saying he will arrive. We're saying I doubt that he will arrive, so subjunctive. It's certain that they will buy a new house. Okay, it's certain though. Think about it. If something is certain, we're expressing what is true, what is factual, therefore it's going to be indicative. Number 5, I'm sure that he's from Europe. Same thing. If you're sure about something, then it's going to be indicative. I advise that you eat more fruit. Well, just because I tell you to do it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do it. So once again, here I'm not describing what is happening, I'm describing what might happen. Same thing, or no, not the same thing with number 7. I know that John lives in that house. If you know something, you believe something, or you think something, then it is going to be true. So I know that he lives in that house. It's going to be indicative. It's important for you to learn Spanish. Well, I tell you guys this all the time. Just because it's important for you to do it doesn't mean that you're actually going to do it, right? So here I'm expressing my opinion. It's important for you to learn Spanish. Again, I'm using the infinitive phrase in English because I'm avoiding using the subjunctive here. In English. However, we cannot do the same thing in Spanish. It's important for you to learn Spanish. I'm expressing my opinion, my desire, my wish, my will. Therefore, I'm going to use subjunctive. All right, if you have any other questions, please make sure you write them down for me so that I can address them tomorrow in class. Y hasta mañana, chicos.